The biting wind howled like a lament in the mountains, and the snow fell in thick white curtains, obscuring the landscape around. The storm had intensified throughout the afternoon, and now, in the middle of the night, it seemed unstoppable. Mike watched from inside his cabin at the wild, freezing exterior, feeling more and more isolated from the world outside. The sound of the wind was deafening, and with each gust it felt as though the very earth was being swept away. He tightened the collar of his jacket around his neck, trying to push away the cold sensation that was beginning to invade even his bones. The warmth of the fire crackling in the fireplace wasn't enough to forget the fury of the storm raging outside. The cabin was his refuge, a safe point amidst the chaos. Here, he had everything he needed: food, water, and the comforting silence of the mountains, where he had found peace, far from the bustle of urban life. Mike was a wildlife photographer. He had spent years immersed in nature, observing and capturing the beauty and brutality of animal life with his camera. However, despite his experience and knowledge, he always knew that, in the end, nature ruled everything. He considered himself a privileged spectator of a world that was often cruel and unforgiving, and on that night, he felt that nature was in its purest state: wild, fierce, and merciless. Sitting by the window, Mike watched the trees swaying under the force of the wind. His mind was distant, but his eyes were fixed on the scene. The snow was beginning to accumulate alarmingly, covering the landscape in a thick white blanket. The storm showed no signs of relenting. Suddenly, something caught his attention. A slight movement in the distance, almost imperceptible. His eyes narrowed, trying to focus on what it was, but the intense snow made it difficult to see. He wasn't sure what he was seeing, but something felt off. Instinctively, he stood up and approached the window, pressing his face against the fogged glass. His eyes were now fixed on a shape that began to stand out against the landscape. It was a dark shadow against the whiteness of the snow, but it quickly became clear what it was. The figure was imposing, a bear, and beside it, something even more remarkable: 2 small cubs. They struggled to walk, battling against the wind and the snow that seemed to want to swallow them. The mother bear, with a visibly tired look, moved forward with a determination that Mike couldn't help but admire. But something was wrong. Her cubs were moving with difficulty, barely managing to keep their balance as the storm dragged them down. Mike felt a tightening in his chest. It wasn't just the sight of an animal struggling for survival. It was a portent of something much more serious. The mother bear was in a clearly weakened state. Her movements were slow and uncoordinated, and the cubs seemed on the verge of collapse. A question began to form in Mike's mind, a troubling doubt. He knew bears were resilient, but the storm seemed unbeatable, and the mother bear, she wouldn't be able to continue much longer. Exhaustion was evident. The struggle for survival was not something he could simply watch, but he also didn't know what he could do. As a photographer, he was an observer. He had always known that, in nature, the cycle of life and death left no room for human intervention. He had always kept a respectful distance, letting nature take its course. But on that night, something was changing. Mike knew he needed to act. But how? He couldn't leave those animals to die there, frozen by the storm. But at the same time, he knew that any wrong move could be fatal for him, for the cubs, and even for the mother bear herself. Every step he took now had the power to change everything. As he looked out the window, trying to assess his options, the sound of the storm seemed louder, more threatening. He couldn't wait. The decision had to be made now. Without further delay, Mike stood up from the chair and moved toward the cabin door, feeling the weight of responsibility in every movement. He glanced once more at the window, the eyes of the mother bear now fixed on him, as if she too were waiting for a decision. She knew he was there. She knew that, at that moment, he might be their only chance for survival. Silence enveloped the room for a moment, the sound of the wind now more distant, as if the universe was waiting for his next move. It was time to decide. Mike stood before the door, his fingers firmly grasping the doorknob, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a ton. The mother bear was there in sight, her eyes locked on his with an almost human intensity, as if she understood the magnitude of what was about to happen. He knew that everything that would happen next depended on the decision he made. Their lives, hers, the cubs, and his, could be transformed by a single gesture. Mike's mind was in turmoil. For years, he had been an observer of wildlife. He knew what was right and what wasn't. His training, his principles, and his safety protocols had always been clear. Never intervene. Nature, he knew, had its own course, and the best thing to do was to document it and respect it. That's how he operated, and that's how wildlife professionals were taught to operate. Mike's hand trembled slightly as he held the doorknob. Opening the door would break all the rules. The storm outside seemed to intensify. The wind howled more forcefully, as if trying to push him away, as if challenging his attempt to step out into the storm. Mike looked at the bears once more. They were so close now, but the mother bear's legs were trembling, her breath heavy and irregular. Her cubs could barely move, the snow slowly covering them, their small forms becoming harder and harder to distinguish from the white landscape. That look from the mother bear was what troubled him most. It wasn't just an expression of instinctive survival. There was something deeper in it. It was as if she knew he had the power to change the fate of those cubs. He could feel that she didn't want to surrender, but her body was giving in to the fatigue of the storm. There was fear in her eyes, a fear of what inaction could mean. Mike took a step back, his eyes still fixed on the window glass. He knew that if he opened the door, he would be taking a huge risk. The mother bear could get scared, she could attack, or she could retreat, taking her cubs farther away, making any attempt at help impossible. He had heard stories of similar situations where human interventions had done more harm than good. But he also knew that this situation was different. The mother bear wasn't being aggressive, nor was she pulling away from him. She was fighting for survival, just like her cubs. Her maternal instinct was at a critical point, and desperation seemed almost palpable. She wouldn't move any further without help, and Mike couldn't just keep watching. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to focus. He thought about the teachings of his father, who always told him that in wildlife, survival was a game of instinct, but also of wisdom. Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, his father used to say. And Mike knew that by opening the door, he would be challenging that wisdom. But at the same time, he felt that ignoring this moment would be an even bigger mistake. With a deep sigh, Mike made his choice. He slowly turned the doorknob, a soft and almost imperceptible sound echoing in the cabin as the door began to give. Every second felt like an eternity. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that if he didn't try, the feeling of failure would be unbearable. As he opened the door, the biting cold of the storm swept into the cabin with a fury that made him gasp. The snow flew in violent gusts, and the wind seemed determined to carry him away, but Mike stood firm. He looked at the bears, now closer, and took the first step outside the cabin. His heart was racing, but his mind was clear. He could no longer hesitate. The mother bear looked at him, her eyes now more alert, but still not aggressive. She was tired, but her gaze carried an intensity of understanding that Mike had never seen in any animal before. She was accepting his presence, but he knew that any wrong move could break that instinctive trust. He began to walk slowly toward the bears, doing his best to avoid any sudden movements. He approached the mother bear, whose breathing was heavy and irregular. Her cubs were practically immobilized in the snow, their bodies frozen and their breathing almost inaudible. The cold was almost finishing them off, and Mike knew he had little time. His decision had already been made, but now the action had to be perfect. As he approached, Mike felt the tension in the air. The sound of the wind seemed to momentarily lessen, as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. He stopped a few meters from the mother bear and looked at the cubs, their small bodies frozen, almost buried by the snow. He felt a wave of compassion and despair at the same time. He needed to act quickly. With his hand still trembling, Mike went to the storage and grabbed a thick blanket. He knew he needed to make the least amount of movement possible, but each action had to be intentional. The mother bear looked at him as he maneuvered the blanket, and Mike could see that she was watching, calculating every step he took. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "It's okay. I'm here to help." Mike held the blanket firmly, his fingers still trembling, but his mind now completely focused on what needed to be done. The storm outside was fierce, and he knew that every second lost meant fewer chances of survival for the cubs. He took a deep breath, feeling the cutting cold of the storm invade his skin, but he focused on the mother bear, whose eyes were fixed on him, watching him intently. It was the kind of look he never imagined seeing in a wild animal. He saw intelligence, understanding, and a tense calm, as if she were trying to process his presence. But at the same time, there was palpable fear. She knew the situation was out of control, and although her instincts told her to stay away from anything that could be a danger, there was something about Mike that seemed to calm her. Maybe it was the fact that she was so exhausted, or maybe it was the understanding that he represented their cub's only chance of survival. With a deep breath and his eyes firmly fixed on the bears, Mike took a step forward, breaking the silence that had settled between him and the animals. The wind howled even louder, and the sound of the snow being swept through the air seemed to swallow any noise he made. But as he got closer, Mike noticed that the mother bear didn't back away, nor did she show signs of aggression. On the contrary, she seemed to be waiting. It was a good sign, but at the same time, unsettling. Mike, trying to stay calm, positioned the blanket over the cubs. His movement was as gentle as possible, almost as if he were handling something fragile and precious. The thick wool covered the small bodies of the bears, and he felt a wave of relief when he saw that the mother didn't attack. Instead, she remained silent, watching him with an intense look, as if evaluating what he would do next. Mike knew that now there was no turning back. He couldn't retreat anymore. Everything he had done so far, each careful move, had brought the bears closer to survival, but he needed to continue. The mother bear needed to trust him, and he knew that any sign of hesitation now could make everything collapse. With cold hands, almost numb from the chill, Mike grabbed another blanket. He moved carefully, spreading it near the storage door, creating a path of warmth. He knew that the mother bear was struggling to stay on her feet, and the faster he acted, the more chances they had of surviving. But the tension in the air increased. The mother bear, still with her eyes fixed on Mike, began to move, her huge form trembling with the effort. She slightly raised her head, her nostrils flaring as she sensed the warmth emanating from the blankets. Mike knew that this was the crucial moment. He needed to continue, but without frightening her. He felt his heart beat faster when she began to slowly move toward the blankets. Her steps were heavy, uncoordinated, and the snow around her seemed to swallow her feet with every movement. Mike stopped, allowing her to approach. He could see the visible effort in her muscles, the battle against fatigue and the cold. But there was something in her behavior that indicated she was willing to try. Or at least she was trying to understand if she could trust him. With a small movement, the mother bear reached the blanket and began sniffing it, her large nose working hard to understand what was happening. Mike remained still, breathing calmly, but his whole body was tense. He knew that any sudden movement could scare her, so he kept his hands well away from her, and his eyes never left hers. The mother bear's gaze was no longer one of desperation, but rather one of silent acceptance. Time seemed to drag on. The snow fell in dense flakes around them, creating a white curtain that seemed to separate Mike from the rest of the world. The mother bear finally moved back a little, her cubs still immobilized under the blanket, but her eyes never stopped observing Mike's movements. He now felt the weight of his actions more intensely. With every passing second, he knew the risk increased. If she reacted badly, she could pull away and never give them a chance again. But if she accepted his help, maybe, just maybe, they would have a chance of surviving. Mike then took another step forward. He slowly picked up the cubs, trying to move their small, frozen bodies with delicacy. They were so weak, their bodies so cold that it seemed they might break with the slightest touch. The mother bear looked at him with a gaze that, to Mike, seemed almost desperate, but he kept his calm and gentleness. He needed to be firm, but gentle. Suddenly, a noise cut through the silence. A crack from a nearby tree made them both freeze. The mother bear quickly backed away, her protective instinct kicking in. Mike stopped as well, his heart racing. He knew that if the mother bear panicked, everything could end right then and there, but to his surprise, she didn't retreat. She stayed there, watching, as if deciding that her trust in Mike had somehow been sealed. Mike took a deep breath and took the next step. He reached out his hands again toward the cubs, the blanket now completely covering them. He moved slowly, each action meticulously planned. He placed one of the cubs on top of the blanket, its small form now a little warmer, and he watched it with a look that almost seemed like gratitude. When he looked at the mother bear again, she had already brought the cubs closer to herself, her body trembling with the effort. She was indeed accepting the help, but it was clear she no longer had the strength to get up. She looked at him one last time with an expression that seemed to mix exhaustion and relief. The storm was at its peak. Mike could feel the cutting winds slamming against the small window of the storage, and the sound of the snow blowing in a deafening whirlwind filled the air. He looked at the bears, who were now closer to the storage door, and his heart tightened seeing the visible struggle of the mother bear. She was still standing, but barely able to keep her balance. Every move she made seemed to require the utmost effort. Mike knew time was running out. With every passing second, the relentless cold intensified. The mother bear looked at him, her gaze tired but full of quiet determination. She had surrendered to the fact that she was relying on him for the survival of her cubs. Now, Mike couldn't hesitate any longer. With his hands trembling from the cold and his body already exhausted from the tension of the situation, Mike approached the cubs, who were now partially covered by the blankets. He realized that, although the cubs were beginning to warm up, they were still in bad shape. They were trembling, and their movements were weak, almost as if their strength was rapidly fading. The mother bear's protective instinct was still present, but he knew she couldn't do much more for them without help. Mike knew he couldn't waste any more time. He turned toward the shelf where he had stored his emergency equipment. There, in a waterproof bag, were the last resources he had to try to save those animals: instant heaters. He pulled one out with his frozen hands, tearing the plastic open with difficulty. Every movement felt heavier, as if time had slowed down as he tried to keep calm. The mother bear watched all his movements closely. Her eyes were so focused on him that Mike felt as though he was being judged. He knew that in that moment there was no room for mistakes. He grabbed the heaters and carefully spread them around the cubs. The hope he felt when seeing the cubs begin to respond positively to the heaters was almost enough to make him collapse. But he knew he couldn't stop now. The air was so cold that the heaters began to create a cloud of vapor that enveloped the room, creating an almost unreal atmosphere. Mike felt his breath freeze as he moved to the side, placing more blankets over the cubs and adjusting them to ensure they were well warmed. The moment was critical. He knew that one wrong move, one wrong choice, and everything could be in vain. The mother bear seemed more relaxed as the temperature began to rise. Her movements were less stiff, but she was still clearly exhausted. Mike knew she was also fighting against the cold, but she showed no signs of giving up. She had a silent strength, a maternal strength that made her resist, even when her own limits were about to be exceeded. The wind outside seemed to howl even louder, but inside the storage, a calm began to slowly settle. The cubs were now warmer, although still not fully recovered. The small body of one of them began to move more visibly, its breathing now more regular. Mike observed the mother bear, who was now crouching next to them, her large eyes fixed on what he was doing. It was a moment of absolute silence. Mike didn't dare break the stillness with words, knowing that any noise could scare the mother bear and make her lose her trust. He just watched the cubs and the mother, trying to ensure that the smallest movement on his part wouldn't cause a negative reaction. Suddenly, a sound that shouldn't have been possible cut through the silence. A deep crack coming from outside the storage shed. The door seemed to tremble slightly. Mike froze. The storm was worsening. The storm outside was not just a force of nature, but a real threat to everyone inside. But he couldn't allow himself to be distracted. He was close. He needed to stay focused. The mother bear's eyes didn't move an inch. She looked toward the sound but made no sudden movements. It was as if she knew Mike was there to protect them. And it was at that moment that Mike realized how deeply he was being tested, not only by the storm, but by the survival instinct of nature itself. Each passing second felt like an eternity, but he knew that the only way to ensure the survival of the bear family was to make the right choices. The weight of the moment began to become even clearer when Mike looked at the sky outside through the fogged-up glass window. He saw that the storm showed no signs of stopping. He needed to act faster. Too much time had passed already, but there were no alternatives left. He moved quickly, grabbing the last supplies of food he had stored. But just as he was preparing to hand the food packages to the mother bear, he stopped. The The mother bear was standing again, but with difficulty. She had looked at him, and her eyes seemed to show a determination he hadn't seen before. She was rising, stronger now, though still with much difficulty. She made a move toward her cubs, but her legs were trembling. Even so, she struggled to rise and support one of the cubs, who had moved closer to her. Mike felt a wave of respect and admiration for this immense creature, who even in such adverse conditions wouldn't give up on her cubs. He didn't know how much longer she could hold on, but he knew that he had done everything in his power to help. The connection between him and the mother bear, silent and intense, was something he would never forget. The silence in the storage shed was profound, almost oppressive. Mike allowed himself a brief sigh, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. The cold still penetrated the walls of the small space where he and the bears were sheltered. The storm outside seemed relentless, as if winter itself wanted to ensure that nothing escaped its wrath. As Mike watched the cubs slowly warm up, he couldn't help but think about his own situation. The mother bear's struggle was far from over. She had managed to get up with visible difficulty, but the exhaustion was quickly consuming her. Her gaze was still focused on her cubs, but her movements were becoming slower and heavier. Mike felt a weight in his chest. He knew what he had to do, but that didn't mean the decision was easy. He looked at the small group of bears, now partially restored, but still so vulnerable. His mind was racing, trying to evaluate the possibilities, trying to calculate the consequences of his actions. The mother bear, who just over an hour ago had seemed on the verge of collapsing, was now starting to move a little more freely. Her cubs were warming up, though with weak movements, there was a slight change. The warm air that Mike had carefully brought into the storage shed was starting to take effect. He could see it in the little breaths of the cubs, which were becoming deeper and more regular. Still, Mike couldn't ignore the fact that the worst was far from over. The storm outside kept gaining strength, and with each passing second, the cold was invading the space, threatening to undo the progress they had made so far. He looked at the door of the shed. A single flaw in his strategy could mean the death of everyone inside, including himself. The dilemma in his mind was becoming clearer by the moment. He knew that for the bears, the shed was a temporary refuge, not a permanent one. They needed to leave, or they would soon get too accustomed to the human presence, which could be fatal for them. Nature didn't forgive, and he knew that better than anyone. The mother bear had her instincts, but he also had his. And deep down, he knew that the decision he was about to make could risk everything. It was a difficult choice. He could open the door and allow the bears to go out into the storm, trusting the mother bear's instinctual strength to lead them back to the safety of the forest. That was what nature demanded. But on the other hand, he knew that the storm was so fierce that the chance of survival for them, especially the cubs, was minimal. Mike was caught between two opposing realities. If he stayed with the bears in the shed, he could keep them alive longer, but that would also mean they would get too used to human presence. Over time, that could affect their ability to hunt, defend themselves, or adapt to the wild. Additionally, Mike himself could be exposed to the risk of a visit from hunters or other predators, attracted by the presence of the bears. He thought of his father again. The words that echoed in his mind were clearer than ever. Nature does not forgive carelessness. It was a simple phrase, but it carried a profound weight. If he opened the door, he was risking everything. He couldn't control what would happen next. If the bears managed to get out and survive, he would have done what was right, but if they didn't, he would have failed. Mike looked at the bears one last time. The mother bear, despite her exhaustion, seemed more alert than ever. Her eyes fixed on him no longer showed the fear and distrust she had before. Now there was a strange understanding, a silent trust, as if she knew he would make the right choice, no matter how difficult it was. It was the final decision. He stood up slowly, feeling his legs heavy, and walked toward the door. The sound of the wind outside seemed louder now, almost like a warning, as if nature were testing his courage. He knew there was no more time. The door was before him, and with it, the answer to the dilemma that had consumed him throughout that night. Mike stopped for a moment, looking at the mother bear and her cubs, who were now a little more active, their movements more confident, though still fragile. He took a deep breath. He knew what he needed to do, and there was no more room for hesitation. With a resolute gesture, he turned the doorknob. The sound of the metal moving echoed in the small shed. He knew his decision was about to change everything. The cold air from outside flooded the space, sending an immediate shiver down his skin. But what he saw was something he could never have anticipated. The mother bear lifted her head, her eyes still fixed on Mike. She seemed to know what was happening. For a moment, Mike hesitated. The strength he felt through the mother bear's gaze was almost suffocating. She seemed to be telling him, without words, that what would happen next didn't depend only on him. It was nature, with all its complexity and power, that would guide the bears to their survival. He took the final step, fully opening the shed door. The icy wind sliced through his skin, but he didn't feel the cold. His eyes were fixed on the mother bear, waiting for her reaction. She looked at him one last time, and with an unexpected lightness, she stood up, with the cubs following closely behind her. Mike watched with a mix of admiration and apprehension as the mother bear and her cubs began walking slowly toward the forest. Every step was a struggle, but also a symbol of resistance. The scene before him was almost magical, as if he had witnessed something beyond human understanding. The trust between them was present, but it was a silent understanding, something that transcended any explanation. As the bears disappeared into the snow, Mike stood there, motionless. His decision had been made, and what came next was a matter of survival, for him and for the bears. He knew what he had done was the best for them, but he also knew that, often, nature demands more than just survival. It demands courage, and he had found his. The sound of the biting wind was the only sound to be heard as the bears left the shed, their immense bodies moving with strength and determination. The mother bear lifted her head one last time, her eyes shining with an intensity that was hard to describe. She looked at Mike, who from a distance was watching everything, his body tense and eyes fixed, as if fearing that at any moment reality might collapse. But none of that happened. With the smoothness of a movement learned during a lifetime of challenges, the mother bear took the first step toward the vastness of the snow. Her cubs, still unstable on their paws, followed her. Each step they took seemed like a victory. The weight of the snow on their young bodies didn't hinder their movements, but the exhaustion from the previous night was still in each of them. Their bodies were covered in ice, their breathing heavy and irregular, but the flame of life still burned. Mike stood still, watching them disappear slowly beneath the blanket of snow. He knew that this would be the last moment he would see these bears so closely, and perhaps the last moment he could truly connect with them. A sense of loss, and also of satisfaction, enveloped him, a mixture of relief and apprehension. The storm still roared outside, but the mother bear, with her sharpened instincts, was guiding her family through what seemed like an impassable landscape. Every step she took was a struggle against the elements, against hunger, against exhaustion. But it was also a step toward freedom, toward the wild that, though harsh and relentless, was their true home. Mike felt a wave of immense respect for the creature before him. He knew that, no matter how difficult his decision had been, it was the only one that could guarantee the bears' survival. He couldn't keep them captive in his shelter. They belonged to nature, just as he had once belonged to it, before being seduced by the safety of the human world. The wind, rising once again, almost caused Mike to lose his balance, but he remained there, unmoving, silent. He didn't know what he was feeling at that moment, but he felt a deep connection to what was happening. The mother bear had made her choice. She had followed her instincts, and now her cubs were following her. With each passing second, the bears grew more distant, their bodies almost merging with the snow-covered landscape. The mother bear paused before entering the dense forest, looking back one last time, as if checking if Mike was truly ready to say goodbye. But he wasn't. He couldn't be. There was no real moment of farewell when it came to something so deep, so natural, just a silent transition. Suddenly, the mother bear turned completely, heading toward the forest with her cubs. The cubs, who had been so weak before, were now more agile, more confident, moving with more purpose, as if the warmth of the shed had rejuvenated every cell in their bodies. Each step they took was firmer, stronger. Nature, surprisingly, had restored their strength. Mike watched, And as he did, his thoughts began to shift toward what the wild truly represented. He had always known it was an unforgiving place, where survival was at stake every day. But what he hadn't expected was how that moment, as simple as watching the mother bear walk into the forest, would affect him so deeply. There was something about seeing the mother bear, the greatest protector of her cubs, guiding them on an uncertain path that somehow taught him something about his own life. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he felt a deep connection with nature at that moment. The idea of protection, of risk, of the constant fight for survival. All of that was reflected in the journey of the bears. They were on the same path as all of us, always struggling, always seeking a way to continue. The mother bear and her cubs disappeared into the tall trees of the forest. Mike remained there for a while, watching the emptiness where they had once been. He felt a wave of gratitude for having been part of that moment, for having helped in some way to keep that family's life intact. But at the same time, he knew that this kind of connection couldn't be forced. Nature had its own way of operating, and he had merely been a spectator in that grand performance. The storm continued to howl, but Mike knew that there, in the safety of the shed, he too was in a moment of transition. His decision to let the bears go wasn't just about saving lives. It was a lesson in freedom, in the space that nature demands, in the respect for all forms of life. He had done what was right, but by doing so, something inside him had also changed. He felt that, for a moment, he had been part of something larger than himself, something that transcended human life itself. When the storm finally began to subside, Mike stepped away from the window. He was exhausted, but there was a sense of peace within him. He knew that the bears were now safe. They had taken the first step toward true freedom, and that was all he could have asked for them. And perhaps in some way, he had also taken an important step toward his own freedom, no longer imprisoned by the fears and dilemmas that had consumed him throughout that night. The relief was something unexpected. After the storm, the wind seemed to have calmed, and the sky began to clear slowly, as if nature were absorbing the tension of the previous day. Mike stepped away from the window and walked over to the small table in the living room of his cabin. There, he sat in silence, his hands still trembling slightly, perhaps from exhaustion, or perhaps from something deeper. His heart was still racing, not from the action itself, but from the emotional weight that accompanied each choice he had made the night before. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to process everything he had just experienced. The bears were now back in nature, in their home, where they belonged, but the decision to open that door still lingered in his mind. He knew he had broken all the safety rules he would normally follow in such situations. He had challenged logic, challenged what he knew about wild instincts, and in some way, nature, with all its brutality, had responded in a way he could not have predicted. But instead of regretting it, Mike felt a kind of gratitude. He knew he had made the right choice, even though the risks were immense. There was something deeply human in wanting to save those lives. Something that went beyond training, beyond protocols, beyond the coldness of a profession focused on observing wildlife. He remembered the expression of the mother bear, that look of recognition and perhaps understanding when she had watched him before heading into the forest. It wasn't a look from animal to predator, but something more, a kind of silent understanding. As the sun rose on the horizon, the temperature outside the cabin remained frigid, but the storm had given a respite. Mike stood up and went to the door, where he had placed some supplies for the bears the night before. With his gloved hands, he grabbed a bottle of water he had left there, his mind still on what he had done. Wildlife had never been about control. He knew that. He had always known. But even with this knowledge, he still couldn't fully understand the intensity of the connection he felt with those animals. The mother bear and her cubs were so different from anything he had seen before. When he was with them, it was as though the barriers between humanity and the animal kingdom disappeared. He was not just an observer, but a participant, an ally in some way. What would happen to them now? He didn't know. And in fact, he would never know. That was part of the challenge. Part of the respect he had for nature. The recognition that we cannot always control what happens, nor can we always predict the consequences of our actions. But sometimes we have to act without certainty. Mike took a few steps toward the window and looked outside again. The snow fell in soft flakes, covering everything with a white, immaculate blanket. The world seemed at peace, but he knew that nature was anything but peaceful. The struggle for survival was underway, somewhere deep in the forest. The mother bear and her cubs were probably beginning to make their first movements outside the shed, seeking shelter, food, protection. He prayed they would succeed. He thought about his own life. He knew how much nature had taught him over the years, since the beginning of his career as a wildlife photographer. That job had taken him to the remotest corners of the planet, had put him face to face with some of the most powerful and untamable creatures on Earth. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the emotional challenge of being confronted with the vulnerability of wild beings who, in an instant, needed his help. He sat down again in silence, reflecting on the weight of responsibility he had felt when making that decision. He hadn't just been a photographer or an observer. That night, he had become an active part of the story of those creatures. He didn't know if it meant something greater, but he knew it wasn't just about saving lives. The act of opening the door had been an act of courage, but also of compassion. He remembered his father's words, a man who had also spent his life in contact with nature. Nature does not forgive carelessness. Mike had always known that, but now he understood what his father had meant in a much deeper way. It wasn't just about knowing what to do or not to do. Sometimes nature required that we make tough decisions, that we risk our own well-being in the name of something greater. And perhaps, just perhaps, those decisions were what truly defined humanity. The warmth of the sun began to heat the cabin, though the exterior was still icy. Mike knew that soon the snow would start to melt, the storm would be left behind, and he would have to move forward. But as he looked out at the world, he realized something new. He felt a renewed connection to the planet, to its creatures, to the rhythm of the wild. Something he may have forgotten over the years. And no matter how unpredictable, unforgiving, and sometimes cruel nature could be, it was also beautiful, pure, and full of lessons he was just beginning to understand. The sound of the wind was softer now, but he could still hear its distant echo. The storm had passed, but not without leaving its marks. Mike knew that, like the bears, he too would have to move on. Life couldn't be stopped, couldn't be frozen in a single moment. We had to live, make difficult choices, take risks. That was what made life worth living. The connection he felt with the mother bear and her cubs would not disappear. He knew that in some way, their journey would continue. And he, in time, would find his own way as well. All he knew was that nature had something to teach. And perhaps the greatest lesson was that, to survive, sometimes we needed to let go, to let others move on their own journey, even when we don't fully understand what that means. The days following the storm passed slowly, but at the same time, with a speed that surprised Mike. The routine seemed in some way comforting, and he tried to hold on to it in an attempt to bring some meaning back to his life after the event that had marked that night. The cabin, with its weathered wooden walls, was quieter than usual. Aside from the occasional sound of the wind and the trees banging against the window, silence seemed to dominate the landscape. But the silence was different now. He no longer felt the emptiness he had felt before. He felt more present in the moment, more attentive to the small details around him. He had fulfilled his role, but the feeling of unease still lingered. Mike knew that the following day would be a new beginning, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling of being disconnected from something more. The bears had left, returned to the forest, and he knew that now he couldn't do anything to interfere further in their lives. But still, a part of him wished he had done more, that he could have offered something more, perhaps continued protection, a safety for the mother bear's cubs. But that wasn't possible. Wildlife, with all its survival cycles, required that beings live according to their own rules. With a sigh, Mike stood up from the table and went to the window. Outside, the snow was slowly melting, as if the earth were gradually recovering from the rigors of winter. The air was fresher, cleaner, and he could smell the damp earth beginning to emerge beneath the white blanket. He felt compelled to go out, to walk, to feel the air in his lungs, to remember what he loved about the natural world. With determined steps, Mike left the cabin and headed toward the forest. The trail he knew so well was covered with snow, but the trees and rocks had been more or less preserved from the storm's impact. He walked in silence, feeling the weight of the snow beneath his feet, the soft sound of nature filling the emptiness of his thoughts. With every step, he reflected on what the mother bear had taught him, how brave she had been, fighting against exhaustion, protecting her cubs at all costs. He had always known that animals, especially predators, were strong, resilient beings, but he had never realized the depth of that strength, how she had been able to withstand the cold, the fear, the pain, the resilience and perseverance of a mother who couldn't afford to give up. Mike smiled sadly, aware that something within him had changed as well. He had learned to fight for something greater than himself, for something that went beyond his own survival. After some time walking through the forest, Mike found the place where, the previous night, he had been forced to make that decision, where the door of his cabin had opened to the bears. He stood there for a few minutes, observing the area around him, and the idea that everything had returned to normal, that nature would follow its course, became clearer in his mind. The bears might have been in danger, but their chance of survival was tied to something greater than him. The mother bear's instincts and the strength of her family were things nature knew how to protect better than any human intervention. He sat down in the snow, leaning against a tree, and looked up at the sky. It was astonishing how everything was moving, transforming with the passing of time despite the difficulties. The storm that had turned everything upside down was already fading away. The clear sky and the sun timidly appearing seemed to send a clear message. Life always finds a way to move forward, even in the hardest of times. As he looked at the horizon, Mike began to feel a kind of serenity that he hadn't experienced in some time. He had made a difficult decision, one that went against all the rules, but at the same time one that seemed to reflect a part of him that he had neglected. Empathy, compassion, and above all, the understanding that wildlife was not just a spectacle to be photographed. It was a life that moved with a force he sometimes couldn't fully comprehend, but that he now respected deeply. As the days went by, Mike resumed his normal activities of photography and observation. He had been successful in capturing some incredible images of wildlife, but none of them seemed as meaningful as the experience he had lived with the mother bear and her cubs. Nothing compared to that. He still took pictures, but now what he sought in the images wasn't just beauty, but also essence, the untold story behind the scene. He now knew that every living being had a purpose, and photography shouldn't just capture a moment, but also the message that moment brought. Life continued at its own pace. Mike began to focus more on understanding animal behavior, observing without interfering, but always with a deeper respect for nature and the challenges it imposed. He didn't know where the journey of his own thoughts would lead him, but he felt that something more important was at stake now: the acceptance of the unknown and the commitment to nature's preservation. He knew that throughout his life, he would make choices that would challenge his own limits. But like the mother bear, he needed to find the strength within himself to move forward, even in the hardest of times. In the weeks that followed, Mike remained in his cabin, but now with a renewed sense of peace. The forest around him seemed more alive than ever, and he felt grateful for each day spent in that powerful and vibrant environment. He knew that one day, he would encounter the bears again, or other animals with equally touching stories. But for now, he was content to have been part of that bear family's journey, even if it was only for one night. Mike felt that the weeks following the incident with the bears had transformed him in ways he couldn't fully explain yet. He continued to work, to take photos, but there was something deeply different in the way he saw the world now. It was as if he had tapped into a deeper layer of connection with nature, something that went beyond the surface, the beauty, or the simple desire to capture the perfect moment with his camera. That event, that desperate night, had shaped a new understanding inside him. When he looked at the images of frozen landscapes or the creatures he photographed, something inside him told him it wasn't enough to just record the moment. There were stories to be told, stories of struggle, of survival, of sacrifices made in the name of life. And these stories now were what he most wanted to capture. At the same time, Mike couldn't help but wonder about the future. He knew that wildlife was constantly changing, that the threats it faced were more frequent, more intense. The idea of preserving nature and protecting its inhabitants seemed more urgent than ever. He wondered how he could contribute to this cause more effectively. Just being an observer, a spectator, was no longer enough. The days following the storm passed slowly, but at the same time, with a speed that surprised Mike. The routine seemed in some way comforting, and he tried to hold on to it in an attempt to bring some meaning back to his life after the event that had marked that night. The cabin, with its weathered wooden walls, was quieter than usual. Aside from the occasional sound of the wind and the trees banging against the window, silence seemed to dominate the landscape. But the silence was different now. He no longer felt the emptiness he had felt before. He felt more present in the moment, more attentive to the small details around him. He had fulfilled his role, but the feeling of unease still lingered. Mike knew that the following day would be a new beginning, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling of being disconnected from something more. The bears had left, returned to the forest, and he knew that now he couldn't do anything to interfere further in their lives. But still, a part of him wished he had done more, that he could have offered something more. Perhaps continued protection, a safety for the mother bear's cubs. But that wasn't possible. Wildlife, with all its survival cycles, required that beings live according to their own rules. With a sigh, Mike stood up from the table and went to the window. Outside, the snow was slowly melting, as if the earth were gradually recovering from the rigors of winter. The air was fresher, cleaner, and he could smell the damp earth beginning to emerge beneath the white blanket. He felt compelled to go out, to walk, to feel the air in his lungs, to remember what he loved about the natural world. With determined steps, Mike left the cabin and headed toward the forest. The trail he knew so well was covered with snow, but the trees and rocks had been more or less preserved from the storm's impact. He walked in silence, feeling the weight of the snow beneath his feet, the soft sound of nature filling the emptiness of his thoughts. With every step, he reflected on what the mother bear had taught him, how brave she had been, fighting against exhaustion, protecting her cubs at all costs. He had always known that animals, especially predators, were strong, resilient beings, but he had never realized the depth of that strength. How she had been able to withstand the cold, the fear, the pain, the resilience and perseverance of a mother who couldn't afford to give up. Mike smiled sadly, aware that something within him had changed as well. He had learned to fight for something greater than himself, for something that went beyond his own survival. After some time walking through the forest, Mike found the place where, the previous night, he had been forced to make that decision, where the door of his cabin had opened to the bears. He stood there for a few minutes, observing the area around him, and the idea that everything had returned to normal, that nature would follow its course, became clearer in his mind. The bears might have been in danger, but their chance of survival was tied to something greater than him. The mother bear's instincts and the strength of her family were things nature knew how to protect better than any human intervention. He sat down in the snow, leaning against a tree, and looked up at the sky. It was astonishing how everything was moving, transforming with the passing of time, despite the difficulties. The storm that had turned everything upside down was already fading away. The clear sky and the sun timidly appearing seemed to send a clear message. Life always finds a way to move forward, even in the hardest of times. As he looked at the horizon, Mike began to feel a kind of serenity that he hadn't experienced in some time. He had made a difficult decision, one that went against all the rules, but at the same time, one that seemed to reflect a part of him that he had neglected. Empathy, compassion, and above all, the understanding that wildlife was not just a spectacle to be photographed. It was a life that moved with a force he sometimes couldn't fully comprehend, but that he now respected deeply. As the days went by, Mike resumed his normal activities of photography and observation. He had been successful in capturing some incredible images of wildlife, but none of them seemed as meaningful as the experience he had lived with the mother bear and her cubs. Nothing compared to that. He still took pictures, but now what he sought in the images wasn't just beauty, but also essence, the untold story behind the scene. He now knew that every living being had a purpose, and photography shouldn't just capture a moment, but also the message that moment brought. Life continued at its own pace. Mike began to focus more on understanding animal behavior, observing without interfering, but always with a deeper respect for nature and the challenges it imposed. He didn't know where the journey of his own thoughts would lead him, but he felt that something more important was at stake now. the acceptance of the unknown, and the commitment to nature's preservation. He knew that throughout his life, he would make choices that would challenge his own limits. But like the mother bear, he needed to find the strength within himself to move forward, even in the hardest of times. In the weeks that followed, Mike remained in his cabin, but now with a renewed sense of peace. The forest around him seemed more alive than ever, and he felt grateful for each day spent in that powerful and vibrant environment. He knew that one day, he would encounter the bears again, or other animals with equally touching stories. But for now, he was content to have been part of that bear family's journey, even if it was only for one night. Mike felt that the weeks following the incident with the bears had transformed him in ways he couldn't fully explain yet. He continued to work, to take photos, but there was something deeply different in the way he saw the world now. It was as if he had tapped into a deeper layer of connection with nature, something that went beyond the surface, the beauty, or the simple desire to capture the perfect moment with his camera. That event, that desperate night, had shaped a new understanding inside him. When he looked at the images of frozen landscapes or the creatures he photographed, something inside him told him it wasn't enough to just record the moment. There were stories to be told, stories of struggle, of survival, of sacrifices made in the name of life. And these stories now were what he most wanted to capture. At the same time, Mike couldn't help but wonder about the future. He knew that wildlife was constantly changing, that the threats it faced were more frequent, more intense. The idea of preserving nature and protecting its inhabitants seemed more urgent than ever. He wondered how he could contribute to this cause more effectively. Just being an observer, a spectator, was no longer enough. The images he had already taken, the photographs of frozen landscapes and the creatures he had documented over the years, began to take on a new meaning. He knew that his photos could inspire others, could help them understand the delicate balance between humans and nature. But he also realized that, in order to do that, he needed to go beyond photography, beyond the role of the observer. He needed to get involved in some way, help educate people, raise awareness about the importance of protecting the natural world. That's why, as he spent more time in the forest observing animal behavior, Mike found himself reflecting on his journey. He had always seen himself as someone who documented nature, but now he felt that he was being called to do more, to act in a more direct way. He knew that change was something complex and couldn't happen overnight, but he felt he had the responsibility to inspire others to act as well. He couldn't continue being just a spectator of the natural world. He needed to become an advocate. On one particularly cold afternoon, while walking along a trail that led to an old valley, Mike stopped and sat under a tree. The wind howled, and the snow began to fall again, covering the landscape with its white mantle. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the wind and the smell of the snow fill his senses. And then, in a flash of clarity, he thought about the bears, about the mother bear he had helped, and about how she and her cubs had managed to survive. The mother bear's struggle, her persistence in the face of adversity, became a powerful symbol for Mike. It was a lesson in life, a lesson he now wanted to share with the world. Mike knew he was at a crucial point in his journey. He had changed in a significant way, but the next step would not be simple. He still had to deal with the fact that his decision to open the door to the bears had gone against all safety rules. He had risked his life and the safety of his own principles. But at the same time, he knew he had done the right thing, that he had acted with compassion and courage, and that this was part of something much bigger than himself. The future, Mike thought, was ahead of him, full of possibilities but also challenges. He couldn't predict what would come next, but he knew his life would be much more than just taking pictures of wildlife. He wanted to be part of a bigger movement, something that would help protect animals and their habitat, something that would unite humanity with nature in a more harmonious way. He was willing to take risks again, this time not just with his camera, but with his actions. Determined to follow this new path, Mike began to plan his next steps. He knew the journey would be long and full of obstacles, but something inside him told him he had the right tools to move forward. Photography would be his way of communicating, his way of touching people's hearts and making them see what he saw, the beauty, the fragility, the strength of wildlife. But he would also commit to getting involved in conservation projects, helping to educate people about animal protection, and working with others who shared the same vision. The following weeks were marked by this new determination. Mike sought more opportunities to collaborate with wildlife preservation organizations. He wanted more than just to capture the beauty of nature. He wanted to preserve that beauty for future generations. He knew his mission now was greater than any photo he could take. The mission was to save what he loved. But there was also something else on his mind. The experience with the mother bear had left a deep mark on his spirit. He knew he had lived a rare moment, one that had transformed his view of wildlife and his own existence. He couldn't just leave that behind and move forward as if nothing had changed. The lesson he had learned about empathy, courage, and sacrifice would be something he would carry with him forever. That night, after a long day of work, Mike sat at his desk and looked at the images he had captured. He felt a quiet peace as he looked at the photos of the creatures that had crossed his path, but he also knew that those images were now just a part of his journey. What he would do next would be more important than any photo. As the wind blew outside, he made a silent promise to himself. He would not just record nature's moments, but he would be part of the fight to ensure that those moments could continue to exist, so that future generations could see the same beauty, the same strength, and the same resilience that he had witnessed. The wind blowing outside the cabin seemed softer, as if nature itself were exhausted after the days of intense storms. The landscape around him had changed once again, now draped in a mantle of fresh, pure snow, which reflected the sunlight in soft, silvery tones. Spring was on its way, bringing with it a promise of renewal and hope. But for Mike, the world around him already seemed different in a subtle, deeper way. He had been changed. In the days following the incident with the mother bear and her cubs, Mike found moments of introspection. He often sat near the window, looking out over the vast snow-covered field in silence. There was something serene about the emptiness of the covered landscape, an emptiness that invited him to lose himself in his thoughts. He reflected on what the experience with the bear had meant to him, how it had been a turning point in his life, a rupture in what he understood as his purpose and the way he should act in the world. In those silent hours, he thought about those who had crossed his path, the difficult moments when he had felt fear, but also saw the resilience and beauty of wildlife more clearly. The mother bear, with her fierce instinct to protect her cubs, her fight for survival. All of this was not just in her genes. It was in her essence, something deeper, more visceral, that transcends any human or animal. That was what Mike felt at that moment, the clash between fragility and strength that coexist in the cycle of wildlife. The decision to open the door to the bears, a choice that challenged all his convictions about safety and protocols, had been an act of pure humanity. But he did not regret it. In fact, he felt an indescribable connection to those moments, a feeling that accompanied him day after day, as if nature had taught him something he could never have learned in any other way. He had a new outlook on life, and he knew that it would forever change the way he viewed his work, photography, and even his own role in the world. Those bear cubs, who had been on the brink of death, were now alive. They were growing. And the mother bear, her strength renewed by the survival of her cubs, represented everything he had always admired about nature. Not just beauty, but also sacrifice, the relentless struggle to ensure the continuity of life. As he watched them walk into the forest, their bodies healthier, Mike couldn't help but wonder what would happen to them over the years. Would they be a success story or a tragedy? The future was uncertain, as it always had been, but he knew that, at that moment, they had a chance. Mike now felt a deep urge to convey to others everything he had learned, not just through images, but through concrete actions. He knew that, with the tools he had, his camera and his voice as a storyteller, he could impact people in a way that went beyond the obvious. He wanted people to look at those photos and understand the true value of wildlife, to see beyond the surface, beyond aesthetics. He wanted people to recognize the fragility and strength of the creatures that inhabit this planet, and understand how every being, whether a bear or an insect, plays an essential role in the balance of nature. His work as a photographer, although always centered on capturing the beauty of nature, had now become something deeper. Mike wanted to document, but he also wanted to protect. He wanted to be more than a passive observer. He wished to be an advocate, an activist. He became more involved with organizations fighting for the preservation of natural habitats and the protection of endangered species. His photos began to be part of awareness campaigns, and Mike started traveling to more remote locations, where the need for help was more urgent. But in everything he did, he remembered that night, the decision he had made, and the lesson that nature had given him. As the months passed and winter gave way to spring, Mike felt that the memories of the mother bear and her cubs had become an indelible part of his life. That moment of connection, of opening his heart to a creature that embodied both the power and vulnerability of nature, would stay with him forever. Not just the images he had captured, but the feeling of having been part of something bigger, something vital. The weight of his actions, the responsibility of having chosen to preserve life, now seemed like an essential part of his being. He could not ignore that. When looking at the photos he had taken, Mike saw in them more than beautiful landscapes or wild animals. He saw stories of survival, courage, and the fight for life. More than ever, he knew his work was not just about capturing nature, but about telling its story in a way that others could hear and understand. And as much as wildlife had always attracted him, as much as he sought to explore the depths of nature and its mysterious landscapes, Mike also understood that his connection to living beings went beyond that. It was a connection that called him to be an active part in protecting and preserving what he loved. And as he well knew, a photograph can inspire, but an action can change destiny. In that final glance out the window as the bears continued their journey into the forest, Mike understood that he too had been touched by a force of nature, a force that would guide him forever, as a reminder that, in the end, what really matters is not the photos we take or the moments we witness, but the choices we make and the way, with our actions, we can preserve what is most precious in this world. Mike stood by the window, watching the first rays of sunlight break over the horizon. The snow, now under the soft morning light, seemed to shine with an ethereal beauty. The storm had passed, and the earth was beginning to recover from the fierce battle it had fought with winter. But for Mike, the real transformation was not on the outside, it was happening inside him. As he looked out over the snowy field, he saw not just a frozen landscape. He saw lives, untold stories of beings who inhabit this world, each with their own challenges and victories. He saw the mother bear and her cubs, their struggles to survive, the inexplicable connection he had felt with that moment. It was more than a wildlife experience. It was a reminder of what really mattered. It wasn't just about recording images, but about understanding, about connecting deeply with nature. He thought about the days that followed, how each decision he had made that stormy night seemed to have brought an inevitable consequence. Nature, with its raw power and at the same time its fragility, had shown him the meaning of survival, not just from the perspective of instinct, but also from a profound understanding of being. The bear, with her desperate fight to save her cubs, and Mike, with his own fear and courage in opening the door, had become part of something much greater than either of them could have imagined. Now, as he watched the horizon, Mike was no longer just contemplating the end of the storm. He was reflecting on his own role in the world. Wildlife photography had always been his way of telling stories, but he knew that, after that night when the mother bear and her cubs found refuge in his shed, he had also become part of a story that would undoubtedly have an impact on his life, but also on the lives of everyone he would touch with his images. Mike's journey didn't end with the storm. It continued in every action he would take from then on, in the way he related to the natural world and the issues of preservation and empathy for living beings. He knew that his choices from that moment forward would be guided by a new wisdom, one he had never imagined he possessed before. There was something profoundly transformative in watching the mother bear and her cubs disappear into the forest. It wasn't just the sight of wild creatures returning to their natural habitat, but the understanding that this was the cycle of life. Nature had not only been generous in allowing him to help, but had also given him a lesson that he would carry forever. Every being has its value. Every life has a purpose. And often, our true task is not just to observe, but to act, to ensure that these purposes can be fulfilled. The connection with the bears, the warmth of life he had helped preserve, stayed with him for a long time. But it wasn't just the act of saving lives that touched him. It was the understanding that, as humans, we are part of a global ecosystem. We are all interconnected, and our actions, no matter how small, reverberate throughout the planet. In the weeks that followed, Mike had the chance to reflect on everything that had happened. He had become more than just a simple observer of nature. Now he felt he had a greater responsibility. It was his duty to protect and respect wildlife, to to understand its fragilities and strengths, and to act to ensure that the future of so many species continued to exist. When he remembered the look of the mother bear when she finally took her cubs to the safety of the forest, he understood the weight of his own choices and the importance of acting with compassion. No matter how dangerous or difficult the path, the need to protect life and ensure a future for the generations to come was greater than any personal fear. He knew that life in nature was not easy, but he also knew that, by making the decision to open that door, he had done something bigger than himself. Mike also remembered his father's words, a man who, though cautious with nature, had always emphasized the importance of respect for creatures and the environment. Now he saw those words with new eyes, understanding what it really meant to care for the world around him. Sometimes the greatest lessons are not learned from books or long speeches, but from lived experiences, moments of courage and choice. As much as Mike would continue his life as a photographer, he knew that his mission was now more than just capturing images. He should be an advocate for nature, someone who, through his work, would seek not only to record beauty, but also to protect the creatures and habitats that, like the mother bear and her cubs, were increasingly threatened. And so, Mike's story, the story of the mother bear and her cubs, came to an end. But the mission it started, the search for a more conscious and connected world with nature, was just beginning. When Mike stepped away from the window, feeling the sunlight warm his face for the first time in days, he knew that life, with all its complexities and challenges, deserved to be lived with compassion and wisdom. As a photographer, he would do everything he could to spread this message to the world. And, as the soft sound of the wind blew through the open window once again, Mike smiled, knowing that, on that stormy night, he had made the right decision. The decision to open the door, not just for the bears, but for a more hopeful and conscious,